I'm Patrick Watson. I'm an astrologer, and you're watching 12 different types of Aries rising. We're now moving on from just 12 different types, right? Uh, what we're going to be talking about right now is what happens when you have planets in Aries, when you have Aries rising. Because while everyone with Aries rising is to some degree represented by Mars, if they have planets rising in Aries as well, then those are also going to be at the forefront of their personality and appearance. So, for example, take someone with their ascendant in Aries with Mercury in Aries. So, while the ascendant ruler is Mars, they would also embody Mercury in some particular way. And Mercury would import its own significations, its own nature, as well as the topics of the signs that it rules. So those would also be brought to the forefront of their character and their general impression. Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo, which is always going to be the third and sixth house of an Aries rising chart. So Mercury would make the topics of siblings, close friends, work, and illness closely associated with their persona and character. Those topics are somehow personal in a sense. If outer planets are in the first house, they import their own significations rather than the specific house topics. They also personally connect nativities to the rhythms of outer planetary transits and have the potential to be iconic, influential, or epochal at those times. We kind of discussed this already with James Dean and Che Guevara, so we won't probably do that too much in detail going forward. But we're going to talk about planets in Aries when you have Aries rising. So, Kendall Jenner was born with Aries rising, with Mars in Sagittarius 9th, with the moon in Aries 1st. So, her moon rules Cancer, her fourth house, which is the house about her family, her home, her origins, her parents. And so even though Mars rules her ascendant, the moon is in the sign of the ascendant. So it's bringing the topics of the fourth to the first. And she is a celebrity, I guess. But she is primarily known through her parents and her family, the Jenners and Kardashians. So that topic is really important for her because, I mean, not to say that, she couldn't be successful if she wasn't a Jenner or Kardashian, but the fact is that she was. She was successful because of her family, and the only reason the broad public knows about her is because she's associated with this important family. So important. Did I just say the word important? Sorry, I meant prominent, not important, never important. But in any case, and this isn't even totally a one-off thing either, because even her sister, even other members of the Kardashian family have significant connections to the fourth, at least for the kids. So, they, some of them who tend to, only be known about through the family or because of the family, not necessarily because of things they did, it tends to show up. Like with Kylie Jenner, she has Capricorn rising with Saturn in Aries, so she has kind of the opposite thing going on. Her ascendant ruler is placed in the fourth, whereas Kendall Jenner has the ruler of her fourth in the first house. Sue Grafton is a detective novelist. She passed on. She's Aries rising with Mars and Gemini 3rd, but she has Mercury rising in her chart. So with Mercury rising on her oh my gosh, all right, here we go. With Mercury rising in her ascendant, the planet of language. It's interesting that she named her detective series after letters of the alphabet, like A is for alibi, B is for burglar, C is for corpse, etc. So I just think that's very weird. That's sort of what she was drawn to. She tried to be a screenwriter for many years, but she admitted she wasn't suited to writing as part of a team, which is interesting when you consider the fact that she, has her ascendant ruler in the third. And so, with Mars in mutual reception with Mercury, it seems like she kind of, that's sort of an ongoing issue for her is difficulty she might have writing with partners, although she did write things with her husband and one of her husbands, and she does have Mars conjunct Venus, so that's conjunct her seventh house ruler. But insofar as Mercury goes, I mean, she wasn't necessarily just a Mars figure, right? She was a Mercury figure. She was a writer. So what's interesting about the mutual reception between Mercury and Mars in her chart is the fact that the protagonist in her story, Kinsey Milhone, is Sue Grafton's alter ego. She says Kinsey's existence allows her to lead two lives, hers and mine. The process of writing informs both her life and mine. While our biographies are different, our sensibilities are the same. I think of us as one soul and two bodies, and she got the good one. Often I feel she's peering over my shoulder, whispering, nudging me, and making bawdy remarks. It amused me that I invented someone who has gone on to support me. It amuses her, I'm sure, that she will live in this world long after I'm gone. It's just kind of weird because Gemini is the sign of the twins, so it sort of gives you that idea of the alter ego or the split lives comment is really interesting when you consider the fact that Mercury and Mars are kind of exchanging places and they're both associated with her ascendant. So in some sense, her creation, Kinsey Milhone, is like Mercury, whereas she's like Mars. I don't know. I just think it's really interesting that she's a writer. Her series is literally named after the letters of the alphabet, and she has Mercury, the planet of language, rising in her chart. I thought that was pretty funny. So John Madden, as a football announcer, he was born with Aries rising, with Mars and Taurus second, with the Sun and Mercury in Aries first. And so he's famous for being a lively and wacky football announcer. And of course, Mercury is the announcer. Mercury is the speaker, and he has Mercury in the first house. And it's funny because we probably know John Madden much better for his voice and for his announcing than we do for whatever he was doing in the second house. He's lent his voice and persona to ad campaigns, radio shows, movie appearances. The Madden video game series is named after him, and he recorded his voice for all of the games. And so yeah, I think with Mercury being in the rising sign, this planet of speech and language, this is the part of him which is much more personalized and on the surface than his ascendant ruler Mars was. Rihanna. Now, granted, it's a C rating, but I think the chart is probably accurate. She was born with Aries rising with Mars and Sagittarius ninth, with the Moon, Venus, and Jupiter in Aries first. So, she's originally from Barbados, but became a star by moving to the United States, living in a foreign place. So, right away, we kind of see how she might embody Mars in the ninth. That's the ruler of her ascendant, Mars in the ninth of foreign places, and the fact that she, that's how she's been able to sort of forge ahead in her life and her career is by leaving her hometown. But how does a Marsy person become a pop star, which is sort of a more Venusian character? Well, Venus is closest to the ascendant. She has Venus rising, and this is often associated with people who are beautiful or attractive. So she is this pop star, and she is this globally famous sex symbol. She's constantly creating music and art, and has this beautiful appearance. And so, yeah, she's got this, Venus and Aries thing going on. And she even has this sort of red coloring. It's very appropriate. With Jupiter in the first, she has a strong Christian faith, and she regularly posts, religious quotes on Twitter and stuff. And so I think it's interesting because, Jupiter rules the the ninth house of religion and philosophy. And with the Moon in the first, she's not Kendall Jenner. She's not famous because of her parents, but her Caribbean roots are prominent in a lot of her music. And she's actually an ambassador for Barbados now. So she's really kind of brought her, she kind of is very proud, of her Caribbean roots and her being a Barbadian. And it just seems to describe that, she's kind of the hometown hero, of Barbados. She's probably the biggest celebrity to come from Barbados, so she's this really, celebrated figure there. So I think that's what the Moon in the, ruling the fourth in the first is kind of about. Derek Hough, I don't actually know how you say his last name. He's a dancer. He's born with Aries rising with Mars and Gemini third, Moon and Venus in Aries first. So he also has Venus in the first, and he's also considered to be a very attractive man. He's featured in People's Magazine Sexiest Man Alive issue as Sexiest Dance Pro. So obviously a lot of his appearance and what he does, is very Venusian as a dancer. And this is interesting because, we would not typically consider Mars to be a dancer, right? But, here we are. We have Venus rising. He's, this graceful, attractive man. Now, with Mars placed in the third house, there's going to be this theme of working collaborations with others. And it's funny because, he's primarily known for his choreography and coaching on Dancing with the Stars. And, he often has, difficulties, teaching, getting these celebrities to learn these dance routines. And actually, it's funny because the third house is about siblings as well. And he has this very close professional relationship with Julianne Hough, or Ho, who is his sister. And it was actually his parents who really pushed him and his sister to become successful in the show business, which I think is probably what the placement of the moon is doing in the first house, since it rules the fourth. David Souter is a Supreme Court judge he has Aries rising with Mars and Capricorn 10th, but he has Jupiter in Aries in the first house. And so, when you think about a judge, you think Jupiter. Jupiter is a judge. Jupiter is more closely associated with things, to do with judges than Mars necessarily is. So it's funny because, he has Jupiter in the first whole sign house. And Jupiter rules the ninth house of law, politics, and philosophy. And so, that makes this a big part of his identity as a, an academic and as a judge. Now, what's really interesting is that, Jupiter also represents issues of the 12th house. And he is considered a traitor to the right wing because he was nominated by a conservative president. And he tended to judge more consistently with liberal judges. So, in a very direct way, he kind of he received an honor from enemies, becoming a judge, and then he became their enemy by exercising kind of Aryan Jupiter judicial independence. Jupiter and Aries kind of saying you're not going to tell me, I'm going to say what I really think. And so, bugs, so many bugs. So Jupiter ruling the 12th kind of in the first, shows how he kind of received this benefit from enemies, and that he kind of made enemies with them through his judicial independence, and then the fact that Jupiter itself rules the ninth house of law and politics and philosophy, makes those topics really central, or at the forefront of his life. How exactly he's like Mars in the 10th? He has risen obviously to high position in government before he retired. And he was, very ambitious and didn't come from, a whole lot. But I guess that's, it shows us how sometimes what's rising is sometimes what's more visible than the planet that's ruling. And I think that's a good example. Joe McCarthy, he's a Red Scare ringleader. He was born with Aries rising with Mars and Libra 7th with Saturn in Aries 1st. And so the stereotype of Saturn is kind of like the villain or the miser, the taskmaster, the one who says no. Is associated with fear and darkness. And so he, Joe McCarthy was this guy who fed off this, anti-communist hysteria, preying on people's fears, leading this campaign to root out alleged communists in the government. This is the Red Scare, which in some ways is a perfect distillation of the idea of Saturn in Aries, the Red Scare. But in this case, Saturn imports topics of the 10th and the 11th to the 1st, giving visibility or notoriety and infamy, but also the topics of government and alliances. He's this government figure and fairly notorious one, and that seems to be described, I think, by the ruler of Saturn, the ruler of Capricorn and Aquarius in the 10th. And he finally met his downfall when he accused the army of communist infiltration. So remember, Saturn's in full in Aries. Saturn doesn't do well there. So he eventually met his match when he went up against the military, and that's sort of represented by Mars in Aries. And he his ascendant ruler is Mars in the 7th. And what's interesting about him is his biographies reveal that his wife, Jean Kerr, was actually the one who really kicked him into high gear with his anti-communist campaign. She kind of, pumped him up, and she covered for him. She doctored photos of enemy politicians so that they looked like they appeared with communists, and she really cracked the whip with Joe McCarthy to kind of hit hard and below the belt. So she was kind of the political strategist for her husband and kind of the agitator. She was really not to discount, the terrible things that Joe McCarthy did and said, but his wife in some ways was really the one who wore the pants, and she, he kind of wanted to be like her. People with Mars in the 7th, when the ascendant ruler is in the 7th, it shows that people want to, become. They try to be with the person that they want to become. So, he was a Mars who just didn't know how to Mars, and so I think that's a really appropriate thing that he had both Saturn rising in Aries and Mars in the 7th in Libra. So you might also be saying that not all people with Aries rising with Mars in the same sign are that similar, and all I have to say to that is the Sun and Moon signs are likely different. They may not be born at the same time of day. I mean, there is still the rest of the whole chart to consider. Well, obviously, we're focusing on the ruler of the ascendant and, to a lesser degree, the Sun and Moon, especially depending on whether they were born during the day or at night. But another way that you could differentiate between matching ascendant rulers is through the phase of Mars. What part of its cycle it's in, what relationships they each have to the Sun. And so specific research on the phase of the ascendant ruler hasn't been done, but here's one example that I think might be worth considering. So we already talked about Brie Larson, right? She's a young actress who, is, as we discussed before, she has Aries rising with Mars and Libra in the 7th. And this shows how she is kind of a Mars operating out of its typical element insofar as, she is in this superhero realm, but as a woman. And so, she'll be kind of providing, this, especially in her role as the new flagship character of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, she'll be kind of giving, a new take or a different, perspective on sort of typical superheroics. And I think this is sort of symbolized by her Mars in its exiled sign. Now, we also have Sofia Boutella, who is also a fairly young actress, and she's a dancer in action movies. She also has Aries rising with Mars in Libra, but in this case, it's retrograde, because you see, Brie Larson has the Sun conjunct Mars, and Mars is invisible because it's, dimmed by the glare of the Sun. But Sofia Boutella has Mars nearly in the same position, but it's directly opposite the Sun. So while Brie Larson's Mars is invisible because it's hidden by the glare of the Sun, Brie Larson's is extremely visible because it's near the brightest point of its cycle, opposite the Sun instead of conjunct it. And so, like Brie Larson, she was originally trained as a dancer, and she kind of broke the mold of a feminine dancer through her very energetic, kinetic, masculine dancing. And this actually made her the face of a popular Nike ad campaign for women. And she further broke the mold of a dancer, of the stereotypical idea of a dancer, by switching to action movies. So, I mean, you would not expect that a dancer would, become like an action star, but she has. She went from dancing to kind of MMA training, and now she does a lot of her own stunts for movies, and it's all based on her background as a dancer. She was recently in the Star Trek Beyond movie. She played the alien, the black and white alien. I forget the name. But she's starting to get into bigger projects now. But so there's some similarities here, but what's the main difference between them? When we try to put them up against each other, how do we see that Brie Larson is the the Sun the Sun Mars conjunct in Libra versus Sofia Boutella, who is the Sun opposite Mars. And I think what we can sort of say is that Sofia Boutella's expression of Mars seems much more physically oriented and using her body to directly express herself and accomplish dangerous things. We could say it's a more external, immediately noticeable, loud expression of Mars. In contrast, Larson's expression of Mars seems more other-oriented, and while not as physically emphasized, more part of her psychology, her spirit, her will, and influence on others. She's the one who actually does the stunts, whereas Brie Larson is kind of more like projecting this role, of someone who does these things. And her sexual assault victim advocacy is very, I think, descriptive of the fact that it's almost like she projects herself through kind of her will and her ideas, whereas Sofia Boutella is just much more actually like physically doing sort of dangerous things. Another interesting contrast between them is that Boutella was actually guided by her father, who was a musician into music and dance, and she's very close with him. Meanwhile, Larson is estranged from her father after he left their family when she was young. And this could be accounted for by other differences between their charts, but worth considering that the sun can describe the father figure, especially in downward charts. It's interesting to consider, the relationship that Mars has to the sun or the father figure, at least in a downward chart. So that is something at least to consider in terms of the difference in phase between two matching ascendant rulers. So the next section is going to be focusing on perfections, annual perfections to the ascendant ruler, as well as to houses when the ruler of the perfection is in Aries. This will be, if you want to see this, then just click the link and you'll be able to get to it. But otherwise, this is the end of my 12 different types of Aries rising video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned a lot from it. I hope you find this useful. And thank you so much for your patronage. And I hope that you'll stick with me to watch the final section of my research on Aries risings in context of annual perfections. Thanks.